All right, well, welcome everyone, and thank you. It's certainly a pleasure to be here, and it's certainly a distinguished panel. I can hardly think of a better group of people to talk about Piranesi and contemporary architecture. Each of these architects has profoundly influenced the way we think about architecture today. Each has realized significant buildings. They've all published, lectured, and exhibited widely. But perhaps more importantly, I think they're all committed to architecture as an art form and a cultural practice. That is to say, they see architecture as having something important to say about our place in the world today. Now, as Dean of the School of Architecture at Princeton, of course, I'm duty-bound and quite happy to note that they all have deep Princeton connections. Starting with Robert Venturi, whom I will introduce first. Bob Venturi holds 2 degrees from Princeton, his undergraduate BA in 1947, and 3 years later, he received what was still at that time referred to as an MFA, a Master of Fine Arts in Architecture. From 1954 to 56, he studied as a Rome Prize Fellow at the American Academy, and on his return, he spent time working for Eero Saarinen, Louis Kahn, and Oskar Stonerov. Since the mid-1960s, he has worked in collaboration with Denise Scott Brown, who studied in South Africa before receiving degrees from the Architectural Association in London and the University of Pennsylvania. Venturi Scott Brown, along with many generations of office collaborators, have completed nearly 300 projects, from urban plans to museums to decorative works, as well as more than 75 major projects for colleges and universities. Of course, they are also known for their writings. Any account of the history of 20th century architecture would have to take account first of Complexity and Contradiction, Bob's book published in 1966. As an undergraduate, I read the early version with the postage stamp illustrations, and that experience of going back and forth between the text and the illustrations taught me a lot about looking at architecture. Of course, their second major publication, Learning from Las Vegas, written with Denise Scott Brown and Stephen Isenauer, suggested that contemporary architects might look at the world around them with more generous eyes, and that the everyday landscape of parking lots, casinos, and roadside signs had something to teach us. Venturi Scott Brown and Associates have received the American Institute of Architects Architectural Firm Award, its highest honor, and in 1991, Bob received the Pritzker Prize in Architecture. Now, returning to the Princeton connection, perhaps the longest standing connection is Michael Graves, who was, for nearly 40 years, one of our most distinguished design teachers. He is now the Robert Schirmer Professor of Architecture Emeritus at Princeton. He received his architectural training at the University of Cincinnati and at Harvard. In 1960, he too won the Rome Prize and studied at the American Academy. Today, his 2 firms, Michael Graves Associates, the architecture and interior design practice, and the Michael Graves Design Group, which focuses on product design and graphic design, employ over 100 people in offices in Princeton and New York City. He has designed over 300 buildings worldwide, and MGDG, Michael Graves Design Group, has designed over 2,000 consumer products. Deeply committed to architecture's visual culture, Graves has been able to synthesize a deep knowledge of the past with the realities of modern life. His work expresses a strong connection to the discipline's traditions at the same time as he sees architectural history as still unfolding in the present. Michael Graves has received over 185 awards for design excellence, including the American Institute of Architects Gold Medal, the highest award bestowed upon an individual. Finally, our third panelist, Peter Eisenman, also taught for many years at Princeton, both in the early 1960s before moving to New York, where he started the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies, and later in the middle 1990s until last year when he decamped for some unnamed institution north of here. Peter holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Cornell University, Master of Science in Architecture from Columbia, and his MA and PhD degrees from Cambridge University. He is an internationally recognized architect and educator. His current projects include a 1 million square foot cultural complex in Santiago de Compostela in Spain, 2 railroad stations in Pompeii, housing in Tenerife. But what I suspect for Peter is more significant the stadium that he finished for the Arizona Cardinals, which opened in August 2006, is going to host the Super Bowl in upcoming February 2008. His projects have received... Yes, exactly. Talk to Peter if you want tickets. He knows the back entry. His many projects have received numerous awards and are widely published and discussed. Parallel to his career in practice, Eisenman has also written extensively. His doctoral dissertation, The Formal Basis of Modern Architecture, has now been issued in facsimile edition. He has published 2 volumes of collected essays and a long-awaited study of Turogni, begun in 1962, which appeared in 2003. In these essays, and in the soon-to-be-published 10 Canonical Buildings, based on his seminars at Princeton, Peter shows himself to be both an extremely acute reader of architecture as well as a provocative theorist. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Academy of Arts and Letters. In 2001, he received the Medal of Honor from the New York chapter of the American Institute of Architects and the Smithsonian Institution's 2001 Cooper-Hewitt National Design Award, and he was awarded the Golden Lion for Lifetime Achievement at the Venice Biennale in 2004. So, as I said, a distinguished panel, almost, I would say, a historic occasion to get these 3 people together talking about Princeton. That was actually a slip. It's not scripted here, I can tell you. Talking about Piranesi. I have just a few remarks about Piranesi to set this up, and then I hope that the conversation will flow smoothly from there. We're going to talk until around 7:45, at which time we can open it up for some questions from the audience. If you can't restrain yourself earlier than that, wave, and we'll see if we can accommodate you. So we can leave time for people to get upstairs and take a look at this extraordinary exhibition. I think it was Tony Vidler, another Princeton connection, who first introduced me to Piranesi when I was an undergraduate at the Institute, and then later I did independent research with Tony on Piranesi as a graduate student at Princeton in the middle 1980s. So I enter this conversation convinced that Piranesi is relevant to contemporary architecture, but I think we also have to be aware that there are many Piranesis. There is Piranesi as an archaeologist, the architect who visited the ruins and measured the Roman architecture. Piranesi as a cartographer. He contributed engravings to the Noli plan. Piranesi as the architect, both of imaginary projects and his one realized building. There is the darker Piranesi of the Carceri or the grotesques. There is Piranesi as a civil engineer who studied and drew bridges and aqueducts. There is the brilliant, if somewhat delirious, plan making of the Campo Marzio, which I understand Cooper-Hewitt's copy will be available for viewing after the panel. Piranesi, as also I think the exhibition makes evidently clear, is an astonishingly good draftsman, astonishingly facile draftsman. He was also technically an exceptionally good engraver. He could pull more prints from his plates than any other engraver in the 18th century. We think of the scenography of the views of Rome, which tell us something about 18th century Rome. And finally, the subject of this exhibition, Piranesi as designer. Someone we associate with Thomas Hope or Robert Adam, designer of tapestries, candelabra, chimney pieces, and, lest we forget, a clock in the form of a pineapple. So, why Piranesi? Why today? How do we sort out the continuing influence of this incredibly prolific and varied architect? It's my sense that Piranesi is so multiple and in this way quite modern that there's something of a kind of Rashomon effect where it's possible to look at the same material from many different points of view and tell very different stories. So to start telling some of those stories, I'm going to move around over there. But perhaps Bob, if you might start, in a way to satisfy my own curiosity, I assume Piranesi didn't figure in an architectural education in the 50s, but maybe he did. How did you first come to Piranesi? What work did you first encounter?
I don't remember a particular moment of. I don't remember a particular moment when I discovered him. I did go to Princeton, which at that time was the only school of architecture virtually in the country, at least among the three leading schools at Harvard, Yale, MIT, that included architectural history in the curriculum. Walter Gropius threw it out at Harvard and so forth. And we designed in the modern mode, but at the same time, we did study history, and that made me very, very happy because I've always been and began being interested in architecture. So I just kind of got to know him early as an important person in the history of architecture. One surprising thing, very quickly, I would say, is that I've learned from this exhibition is that he had such a kind of eclectic combination of media and accomplishments, because we think of him mostly as a great, for his great etchings, especially of the carcere. I say carcere, everyone says carcere, I don't know which it is. Anyhow, he has been very inspiring. I think one other reason I was brought into this was that it seems to be evident to people that the design for the chapel of the Episcopal Academy, a school outside of Philadelphia, that is now being built, the interior of that, according to the drawing we made, looks Piranesian. And when I designed that building, or we designed that building, I wasn't thinking of Piranesi at all. It evolved out of the immediate needs of the project. And oh, by the way, it turned out to look like him, I guess you would say, inside. But that Piranesi was not directly an inspiration. That's very funny, because I'm here, therefore, under false pretense. I shouldn't be here. On the other hand, having some knowledge of the history of architecture, I guess I can connect with Piranesi. And he is, I think, terribly relevant now, partly because of his, as I say, as we've all said, his eclecticism, his range, and the fact, I think that that's very appropriate. Now we're no longer in a period where we have one ideological ideal and approach in architecture that we follow. We are open to many cultures and to many. We go from pop culture to high culture to pop culture, in between, or some of us do, and that is, I think, it does kind of connect with the approach of him. One last thing I'll mention, kind of personally, is that he obviously was very inspired as a young architect or as a young designer by Rome and by going to Rome, as I was. I still celebrate the anniversary of my first day in Rome every year, August 8th, and invite friends, and we have dinner at a particular restaurant in Rome. So Rome was extremely inspiring. It wasn't so much for me, the Roman ruins, as it was the early Christian basilicas, and also the Baroque Rome, where I learned a lot about space, and then about the urban quality of Rome, where I learned a lot about urban, certain aspects of urban, and about the city that accommodated the pedestrian very much. And it was fun that while I was in Rome, I was able suddenly to look back at America, as so often an expatriate artist does. You look back at your country and you learn more about it from a new perspective. And I saw Main Street as relevant. And I think that's when I said Main Street is almost all right.
Well, Peter, to give you an opening here, not necessarily Bob's last comment, but the the embrace of eclecticism as characteristic of our moment today. I'm wondering if that's something you can agree with. You have a different reading of that. Where would you go with that?
Oh, should I be nice and say I agree every 100%? We're here.
No, then we won't have anything to talk about.
First of all, I want to say that I first met Michael Graves in Rome, which has something to do with the fact that Bob celebrates Rome. We all feel strongly about Rome. I was just 3 weeks ago with some of our students up north in the Piranesi church, and I would argue that to go to that building is really important for anybody going to Rome. I don't call Piranesi an eclectic. I don't feel that it describes him in a positive sense, even though eclectic may be something that's fashionable. I think Piranesi is the first modernist, and so therefore I'll go off on the wrong side of the table, as I think Michael Graves was the first modernist at this table, but he may not be. Think of that. As I think Bob Venturi was a modernist in his work, and probably still is, both of whom I admire greatly. But I think Piranesi's Campo Marzio, to me, is one of the great moments in thinking about urbanity and thinking about time and place and space, and to have that kind of inspiration is quite extraordinary. I'm still not certain about the relationship of Piranesi to Noli, which is one of the artifacts I believe that sparked an idea about context and contextualism and sparked Roma into Rota, because I have a copy of the Little Noli, which is attributed to Piranesi, and if you look at the etching on of the urban fabric, it is practically the same as Noli. So I'm always curious. I've never gotten a good answer as to who had the rights to what, but it seems that Piranesi could have reprinted parts of that Noli map. As to a direct influence, I don't know. I mean, I bought a set of the Capricci, the Groteschi, whatever you want to call them, from Ben Weinreb in 1982. And they were I've always looked at them. I think they're very important. I don't know how to describe them. As I don't know how to describe Piranesi, I mean, I go to the church, and it's certainly, when you go to the back of the altar, as Manfredo Tafuri has talked about, it's quite stunning. And whether because the front is different than the back, it makes it eclectic, maybe. I don't know. But it's something that is, to me, a very important moment in the history of architecture. I've often said that the kind of space that I wanted between the concourses and the outer skin at the stadium, I wanted it to be Piranesian. I use that term because the kind of secondary steel that we wanted exposed reminded me of sometimes of the carcery. Whether it's real or imagined, I don't know. But to me, I've always taught him, collected him, and used him as a model for my students. So that's about what
And you collected him first, before you taught him.
Yes, but no question.
Yeah.
I happen to have a beautiful Campo Marzio. I'll tell you the very funny story. It was bought about 1982 at the same time in Rome, and I couldn't afford it. And I paid for it on time, but it came and it was rolled up in a tube under my desk when I got married to my present wife. But I couldn't tell her that I had bought this thing for the enormous price that I had. And it sat there for 10 years, nobody knew what it was, right? And finally someone said, "What the hell is that tube under your desk?" And so we took it out and framed it. probably for more expense than it was worth. So that's one of my Piranesi fantasies.
It's curious to me that when we characterize space as Piranesian, we almost always refer to the Carcieri, to that very complex space that kind of unfolds and is difficult to describe. I'm thinking, Michael, in some of your plan-making strategies, where there's a sense of very clear individual figures, but then a way of resolving kind of complex site and program geometries, there's something of Piranesi's plan-making language that doesn't necessarily translate into that kind of unknowable space of the Carcieri.
Certainly it doesn't. I'll get to that. I just wanted, before I forget, Bob Venturi said something I think is very important as something that distinguishes him amongst most architects, because Princeton School of Architecture was very small when Bob went there, and as he said, he learned the history of architecture there. There's a wonderful Frenchman, Jean Lavetou, who was there, was influential. But the school was based in modernism, but history was seen as I understand it, the continuous language that modernism was to be a part of. That was very different than my education. When I was a graduate student at Harvard, I had Piranesi open on my desk, one large elephant folder of Piranesi to look at him before starting a project. Not that one was going to make it Piranesian, but just as a kind of release and understanding what he could do and others. He wasn't the only one I looked at. But I remember the dean, who was called, careful of this, Teeny Weeny Deanie, he came to my desk, and Jose Loisert, and he said, "What is that? What are you looking at?" And I told him, and he said, "You won't need that here." This is Harvard. And Bob's right, it was Gropius's Harvard still, but by that time it was turning to be Le Corbusier's Harvard, and nothing else would do. So when I went to Rome, I started with a great deficit, because my history in architecture had been taught to me by Siegfried Gideon. And some of you know what that means. It means no history after the Second World War, before the Second World War. Anyway, no, I don't think very much of the Carcieri, and I think of them usually last. And I think that the spatial dimension that he's able to afford us in, meaning Piranesi, in looking at and framing techniques that he used, whether at Pestum or St. Peter's or wherever, brought us into the place that we weren't, the square, the space between, in a way that is more normal to us and to what we are able to understand, but at the same time sheds a light on it that one would never have gained without his drawings. And therefore I think the Carcieri for me are too easy. They're fantasies, they're wonderful, and all that they try to express, and the spaces beyond, and the dungeons, and the dreadful life that was being depicted by them. But okay, I got it, and it doesn't hold the mystery for me that almost everything else does, especially for me, surprisingly, the pragmatic drawings, the drawings of opus reticulatum, of various brick patterns, of the way a facing was put on a rubble wall. All of that discovery, very much like Stefano Toprak, where the discovery of those methods allowed him and others around him to build for us in drawings that wasn't there, because they knew in the compressive strength of those walls what might have been above them.
I'm just curious how, I mean, I agree with that. I'm curious how you reconcile that with, or maybe it doesn't need reconciling, with some of the more decorative work upstairs. What's the passage from construction to decoration in Piranesi?
One is one thing, one is another. One is applied and thematic, and the other is very, I think of as in terms of the human scale, sounds saccharine, but the way a stone was lifted into place by one or two people, very different than lifting a wall today by crane, and the joinery that we were afforded to read in his drawings and in the buildings themselves gave us a way of putting ourselves into the milieu of that building. The decoration is the way I look at his decoration very different than other decorations of other people. I was talking to a former colleague of mine tonight about Luckman's reveals in modern and minimalist architecture. That's decoration. That's not the way two materials necessarily want to come together or could come together, but they're done that way because materials move at different rates, and that's the modern architect's way of bringing those together. But it doesn't help me understand my size within the room or the space.
Which you're saying the decorative work of Piranesi does.
Yes, in its thematic nature. When you have a slot between two pieces of material, it doesn't help me very much. I know where it comes from.
I mean, Peter, I may be wrong on this, but it seems to me if there's another sort of split in Piranesi, it's somehow from a modern perspective, it's easy to look at Piranesi's plans. There's a level of abstraction that allows us to see something quite contemporary in them, whereas in the vertical plane, in the more decorative work, it's somehow more historical, a little harder to approach. Does that coincide with your reading?
Well, I have difficulty making objects, and so as you know, Michael and Bob have done wonderful things in furniture and other kinds of objects. I've been trying to design a chair for years, and I can't do it. I don't have it, and so therefore, no amount of looking at Piranesi is going to help me. To tell you the truth. Well, whatever, you know, sideboards or what, you know.
Chimney pieces.
Chimney pieces.
We're waiting for the Eisenman chimney piece.
Yeah. A whole field of chimney pieces in Berlin. They weren't Piranesi. Frankly, I don't look at that material. I mean, I love the maps. I collect all of his maps. For me, the maps are extraordinary. The historical ones, the fantasy ones. I mean, there must be 8, 9, or 10 maps, and I find them extraordinary. I've always collected cartography in one form or another, guidebooks and data guides. So for me, maps are very interesting. If a map is an ultimate form of abstraction, so be it. I don't think maps are modern. And the great breakthrough, I think Noli's map is one of the great breakthroughs in cartography to make public space and private space differentiate is very extraordinary. And I think the Noli map is a very important work. And I think Piranesi's Campo Marzio, which works differently, is another important work, and I think those two works are, for me, very important. Are they abstractions? I couldn't say that. But being interested in maps and being interested in chimney pieces is certainly a very different occupation.
But for Piranesi, he was perfectly comfortable doing both.
Yeah, I don't have that range.
Are you reaching for the microphone? I hope.
I don't have that range.
Yeah.
Well, one thing I think is we shouldn't leave out the word symbolism and the fact that his ornament involves symbolism. It isn't abstract. With him, it was historical, generally reference to Rome, very often, to a great extent, to classical vocabulary. It might be that for us, the symbolism should be that of, as we've been saying for some decades now, the inclusion of pop culture, of the American commercial vernacular. And that's something we can learn from, just as I said, that the early modernists learned from the American industrial vernacular. And certainly the pop artists knew that and did that after 50 years ago. And I think we can evolve from that and learn from the everyday iconography, the everyday symbolism of today. And I think that's something that architects should look at. Some of us have, some have been looking at, and I think that is something that's for now. And
Yeah.
it would kind of parallel what he was doing 200 years ago.
But do you think it was, was that language, did it have the same currency as the vernacular did today for Piranesi in Rome in the 18th century? Would you make that argument that it could communicate as seamlessly as popular culture does today?
I think that you're looking at, well, there's not an exact parallel there, but I think you're looking at the ordinary and seeing in it the extraordinary. You're looking at an aspect of our culture that is pretty vital. A lot of it's pretty awful, but a lot of it's pretty vital that we can learn from and consider as a source.
Yes. Yeah.
But again, it's the symbolic content, not ornament as abstract, and just as for him, it was not ornament abstract.
Mm-hmm. But there's also something in some of his decorative works too, where you almost have a feeling of a kind of plane with applied. I mean, it's very sign-like. It's very much invested in that
Bob, can I ask you
decorated surface.
Good.
Can I ask you a question? Because you and I were last in Hagia Sophia.
Last talked in Hagia Sophia.
Yeah. Would you say that the ornament there is abstract?
Well, I would say in Hagia Sophia there isn't any ornament left. It was all removed, especially by the Muslims. But evidently it was, the surfaces, the pendantas and all were teeming with mosaics and with Christian
I'm talking about
advertising.
the arabesques and the motifs from the Middle East. Doesn't seem to be as symbolic as
I don't think so. I don't know enough about that culture. I think part of that culture, part of that religion says, you cannot have you cannot have indication of men, and all that stuff. So I don't quite know how to answer that.
I don't know.
That's my favorite building. I last saw him, our favorite building.
With Zaha.
Denise and Zaha, I did a combination. We got along quite well. But anyhow, Hagia Sophia is maybe my favorite building in all history, even though we only see part of it. The minarets, I think, are not relevant, but but we do not see that iconographic, ornamental, decorative quality that the early Christian architecture had, that I believe was mosaics. And that's sad. What a building, though.
But you've connected those mosaics also even to contemporary electronics as well, right?
Yes, I had fun saying that maybe the medium for today is the electronic medium, the LED elements, and there's what do you call the LED elements?
Pixels.
Yeah. That those are the equivalent of, to a great extent, of the shining ornament of mosaics, although they're even better because they move. And you see that beautifully at the entrance to Pennsylvania Station. But of course, the other night we were here, and taxi drove down 7th Avenue. And we all know it, but I mean, every time I get down there, I'm just amazed. Looking down 7th Avenue toward Times Square, and that is sort of the great space, to me, the great urban space of today, the equivalent of the Piazza San Marco. And then we passed that building. It's 49th, what is it? 49th and 7th. Lehman Brothers, yeah, with all of that information and going along it there. I love it. Then we turned right and went to the Yale Club.
Do you think it'll make the history books like San Savina?
Oh, I think so.
You do?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And the urban, for urban design. And of course, what is the great street? I go with my forgettery. My mother used to say, when she got old, I no longer have a memory. But I have a forgettery. The great street in Shanghai, not along the Bund.
Nanjing Road.
Was it?
Nanjing
Road. Thank you. I have a memory over there. Nanjing Road. I have that over my desk to remind me. It's one of the great urban elements, designs of our time.
Michael, you're looking a little skeptical about the electronics.
I'm still stuck on Zaha.
Hiya, Sophia.
With these two characters. No, it's not what I understand. And I always have trouble when technology is, in the broader sense, becomes the symbol, as it did for us in the 60s and 70s in structure, and because we know it's going to be replaced, then there's the new one, and there's the new one after that, and get your iPhones quickly, because there'll be another and another. So I found that's too fleeting for me, and that's hard enough for me to get my email. I'm too old-fashioned.
Well, you did, before you leave the microphone, you did promise to get back to the plan-making strategies. And whether the Campo Marzio, or is it more directly from Rome, that there's, seems to me, something in the way you put buildings together in plan.
Oh, I don't think it has anything to do with me. I think Peter draws an interesting distinction between the two. Peter's article that was published in the Piranesi catalog for this show is an important work. I think it's very clear, it's concise, but at the end, I think he passes the ball.
You're going to tell us what that is.
I don't. If you all imagine, those of you who don't know the Compass Martius plan, imagine a series of objects on a field, all of them interesting in their own right, some of them symmetrical. This is bad for Peter, but some of them symmetrical, some of them asymmetrical. Not all of them symmetrical, and they are scattered in a very delicate and deliberate way. And the Noli plan does something entirely different. I think most of us would agree that the difference between that's post-shade in a kind of dark gray or black, and in the Noli plan that is private, that's mostly housing and shops, as against the public buildings, public spaces, the interiors of the churches and the Pantheon and other places we're to read as part of the urban fabric or the ground plane is a very important contribution. Think of our cities that certainly weren't made that way. First thing we did, being Puritans, we closed the churches except for Sunday morning. So you couldn't have it as part of the street. We didn't build our churches by and large on the street. We built them in the square somehow or separate from it. And therefore, there are those objects in the city like the Pantheon and objects of space like some of the great squares in Rome that count for a continuity that is rarely seen in any city. That continuity, I presume, is true in the Campus Martius in that everything is drawn as if we blew it up to a reasonable scale, we would see the plans of the rooms, practically, of those buildings. Therefore, it is all an open field. There is no distinction between what is private and what is public, or even semi-public private. And therefore, that's the distinction made. Now, if we fast forward into today, and you mentioned Rem Koolhaas a while ago to me, I would think that Rem would come down heavily on a series of very, very large buildings occupying an open field with God knows what taxis and automobiles and people darting between one and the other with no apparent order between them. And that would be my problem with Campus Martius if we took it in its literal form today. We wouldn't have the structure of the city of movement patterns, public and private, that I think is probably necessary for all of us. The difference between an open room in our houses and the closure of something private in our houses.
Well, in fact, one of the astonishing things about the Campo Marzio is almost a total absence of private space, which is one of the things that's
right.
In a way makes it so odd.
It's odd and fascinating because of that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, on the ground level.
Exactly, on the ground level.
On the ground level, I think that is, I forgot what I was going to say now. Viva Campo Marzio.
Well, I saw, Peter, you were nodding when Michael was describing what for him were the negative qualities of Campo Marzio.
I was
describing it.
I was describing it.
Yeah.
He did not.
Yeah.
Michael
Yeah.
says it's both troubling and I mean, what he
Right.
finds just troubling is its modern day equivalent.
Mhm.
All right. That's all he really said. And you missed it. You got it?
Well, very much.
Came
When I
back.
was actually the other thing I was going to say was, one very significant thing is that the Campo Marzio and the room of then is essentially pedestrian, maybe an occasional carriage would go through. And of course, very significantly, our cities are based on automobile transportation. And that's when we, in Rome, I probably began to realize, what a difference, why we went to Las Vegas. We went to Los Angeles. And then from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, because we wanted to see the city of the automobile. And that is extremely significant, and it still is. It's a little less significant in Manhattan, which is automobile, but it's not automobile to the extent that LA is or those other cities. And that is something we learned from very much, the automobile city.
I think that one of the things that, Michael, you and I would agree on about Campo Marzio, they were all buildings of inordinate architectural energy, right? And that what I think Piranesi was saying is that architecture was still very important as an urban icon, let's say. And too often the urban planners of today forget whether they're into contextualism or not, leave architecture out. And so for me, the emblematic nature of Campo Marzio is in fact that it's all architecture.
And that emphasizes that today the city is less architecture, and you're saying, but what takes its place? Signage. And it is a new form of symbolism, and we must remember the significance of signage, and why, and when we look at, again, the extreme examples of the Piazza San Marco on one hand, and the 7th Avenue and down to the Times Square as the other, and therefore signage is important. And that isn't new. When you go into a Byzantine cathedral, if the mosaics are still there, or you even go into a Renaissance church, or you go in, let's say you go into a Gothic church where the stained glass, we look at the stained glass as beautiful art. Stained glass windows, well, it's incidentally beautiful art. It was there they didn't have electricity, so they used the light coming through, and it was there to instruct the populace, who were mostly illiterate. So the idea of signage as part of architecture is not new. It's something we forgot about in the 20th century, except we didn't forget about it in the commercial aspect of 20th century. And I think we must learn from that, and we can learn from that. So let us not forget that. So it's maybe no longer the architecture and the refinements of architecture that our sensibilities can connect to. It is the information, or the information age, that the buildings emit, and whether it's, now a lot of that can be bad. In Mussolini's Rome, you had fascism advertised, or trying to convince you to be a fascist. But also, and today we have the commercial. I don't think the commercial's that bad. That they convince me to try to drink Coca-Cola. That's okay. They don't have to. So I think we must again connect with the information and go back to what did exist in architecture before our century, which was iconography, and maybe the electronic medium can work that way.
Let me ask, because this is, I think, a good point of discussion, Michael. I would have thought that Piranesi's plans were symbolic of something. I mean, at the time, they stood for something. I think they're very much like your ducts and decorated sheds. I mean, Piranesi's buildings are ducts in a certain way. And so therefore, I always thought that ducts were okay, that they were as symbolic as decorated sheds. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I think there's room for both.
Both, right.
Absolutely, combination of it.
Ducts and decorated.
But let's not forget the decorated sheds.
No, not at all.
Always said that that's commercial.
If you look at what goes down today in any book on modern architecture or any magazine, they're all ducts.
They're all ducts.
They're all things. They're just.
But that's in the magazines.
I know, but
It's not in the real world, which is.
but the problem is that when he writes about it in the New York Times, and somebody is looking for a new architect, they go to his choices, which are people who make ducts.
I agree.
Yeah.
Period. All right. And Bob's right, they have to have both. But most of them are decorated sheds. Most of them are red, bottom to top, top to bottom, side to side, in a series of symbolic gestures that give you time to understand what it is and what it isn't. So it's not a thing, singular thing.
Michael, just so I feel better, I wrote a critique of Charles Jenks's latest book, and I called it Duck Soup. So I'm not on the duck side either.
No, I don't think you are.
What are ducks and decorated sheds?
Ducks, well, I mean, he's the guy that coined the thing, which has still got enormous potency. A duck is something that looks like what it does, like a hamburger stand in the form of a hamburger, and the duck was the duck in Long Island that sold ducks, right? And a decorated shed is a thing in a western town, in a western movie, where there's a box in the back and a front that says cafe or general store or whatever, and in modern times, you know, a Greek facade on a bank or a post office, etc., with a dumb box behind. That's a decorated shed.
And of course, if that isn't, we're all New Yorkers or semi-New Yorkers, but if you're a Westerner, you know, you see that the buildings are back from the highway and all that old-fashioned architectural refinement and detail doesn't mean anything. You can't see it.
Yes.
And you need this kind of, you need a Pavarotti singing, so to speak, out there, singing loudly to get it across.
You should hire Peter to do your thing for you. One last question, because it seems to me not completely coincidental that this exhibition, which focuses on the decorative work of Piranesi, is arriving at this particular moment. When, although certainly a lot of the work that gets published is highly sculptural and duck-like, there is a lot of interest in contemporary architecture, returning interest in the surface. A lot of it is generated by new potentials of computer fabrication and the ability to realize
They're surface ducks.
their surface ducks. There's a kind of, but somehow the kind of intricacy that's possible in contemporary computer-driven manufacturing seems parallel to some of the intricacy that you see upstairs. But is it just a surface duck?
No comment. I think they're surface ducks.
Yeah, I think you see two things upstairs. You see the
Surface ducks upstairs?
No,
or the,
surface ducks
out there.
out there.
But up in the Piranesi, you see the Donati space light and stuff like that. But then you also see the very delicate ornamental stuff and furniture that he did too. It's kind of neat. And I think there's a moment, but I think we're now in an era where you want to talk. I think someone's saying it.
All right.
But in an era now where you really need to think in terms of whammo kind of media to get the ideas across. We're in this era now where we look at TV at movies and so on. So.
Well, I suspect there are people out there who are waiting to ask questions.
You better.
You better, yes. This is your chance.
Well, you mentioned ducks and decorated sheds and learning from Las Vegas, but can people hear me? Hello? Okay. Good. You mentioned learning from Las Vegas and the duck versus the decorated shed. But what impact do you think complexity and contradiction had on this conversation? Had that book not come out, would we be having a different conversation now?
Well, there's a good tennis ball being thrown up. I'll hit it because he can't answer. I think it was the first book of American architectural theory. I firmly believe that. I think it changed the course of architecture in this country profoundly. And there hasn't been a book written by an American architect since that has had the impact of that book. And I think Pox to Robert and his 300 projects, I never realized he did 300 projects. He was always worrying about not having enough projects. I couldn't imagine doing 300 projects. But in any case, I think for me, Corbusier said I need to do a book for every building. I do, and if he's done one book for the 300 buildings, it's equal to the 300 buildings as far as I'm concerned, and will be seen to be so in history.
This guy's crazy.
I believe that. I mean, I've said it and written it, so. No. Who would have ever looked at Aldo Rossi if he hadn't done the book Architecture of the City? You tell me. I don't think many people would have. Certainly, I think that that book changed a lot of things. I don't know name another book done by an American architect since.
It is too bad that you have to write a book very often to get a job or to get the job. To get
Court
recognition.
move.
In order to
Court, yeah.
Frank Lloyd Wright.
Same, right, the same.
But in a way, Piranesi is the model. I mean, one building and all of those drawings and all of those folios and engravings. Yes?
This may seem like a strange question, but because I've read Mr. Venturi's readings, but it seems I've been looking lately at Paul Rudolph's concrete buildings, photographs of them, etc. And could you comment on whether they might be the most Piranesian of all the when you think of the way he treated space and so forth, and how he could draw?
Anyone else?
I don't think he has the vitality of the Piranesian thing. He has something else. He has sort of native ability. But I don't see that myself.
I think that's a terribly interesting question. I can't answer it, but he certainly had a facility, Rudolph. The early work with Twitchell and in Florida, I thought in certain instances was highly inventive, but that dissipated into a kind of known formula that was repeated over and over again, where it became very uninteresting. I don't think that happened to Piranesi, but I think the parallel is a difficult one just based on draftsmanship.
I'd like to answer the Rudolph question, or Michael, you want to finish? I work in my teaching in a Rudolph building. I used to think it was a terrible building to work in until we were moved into another modern architectural building by another firm unnamed. And I can't wait to get back to my Paul Rudolph building. It has nothing to do with Piranesi. I think Rudolph was an incredible teacher. I had him as a teacher when I was an undergraduate. I think he was a fantastic talent. And what we think of, I think it became repetitious, as Michael said, and formulaic, but some of the early buildings in Florida, but I think also the A&A building at Yale is a stunning work. And I only appreciate it now being in another not so stunning work for the year.
One thing about the arts architecture building at Yale and other projects of Paul Rudolph, especially his house that he renovated in New Haven, is that there was certainly somebody home. You really felt the gravity of the architecture. It didn't leave you as a bystander. It was like a Frank Lloyd Wright house in that you had to contend with it day and night, whether it was a glass stair or walking on a piano or something else ridiculous. So when somebody was home and it was causing you to think about those things. I don't know whether I can draw this parallel, but we were all struck by Bob's great book. And I remember Charles Moore saying once to me and to a small audience something that was in those days blasphemous. And in a way, Bob made us think, well, if it weren't this, then how about it being that? Or drawing our attention to oppositions. And what Charles Moore said, which I was fascinated by because I believed it, but I hadn't kind of reconciled it in my own mind, and that he took a giant of our time at that time, who was Lucan, and he said, the Salk Institute stinks. And most architects of our generation were brought up to think it was heaven on earth. And he said that plaza that dies off the end and goes into the ocean is just this peopleless, terrible, sun-drenched thing. And there is nobody home. And he was, for me, maybe not for these two, but for me, absolutely right. But I love Lou for other reasons and so on. But he made by making that comment the way Tom Wolfe did with Bauhaus and our house, saying the opposite. It made you realize that maybe we had just gone down a merry path of thinking this was pretty good or great or whatever. Maybe it wasn't.
Back there.
Peter, I think you said something about Piranesi being the first modernist, and I was wondering if you could say more about that.
No, if I start to say more about it, it'll lose its impact. It's an apocryphal statement. Which would, I thought, cause the opposition, let's say, to react. But since I got no reaction, I just want to leave it alone.
Well, he wasn't the first archaeologist, so perhaps he was a modernist, I don't know. But there were others before him discovering those things that made us look at the antique in a new way. Then Piranesi simply wasn't the first.
Well, it makes a good line.
I've been with you for many. And by the way, the person that found the tube under your desk was, in fact, it makes a much better story, was your wife.
I don't think she did.
You told it that way once, and it was much.
He was there for 10 years.
I know.
I'm the one who got it framed too.
Yeah,
I'm the one who took it out.
yeah.
Anyone else?
We're starting to fracture here. It's almost time to go. I got the sense that, if we have to sit here together any longer, it'll get gracious.
We're actually waiting for that moment. Well, there is a beautiful exhibition waiting upstairs, so if there are no more questions, I just want to thank these three panelists.